Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today I'll briefly be discussing point of view, how to analyze and look at point of view in any given short story or a novel. Now, this was a query sent to me through comments on one of my videos, and I reflected about it a little bit, so I hope this gives you, if not an exhaustive answer, at least somewhat of a satisfying answer. So here we go. So the point of view in any given short story or a novel is when we try to trace how the narrator is described or how the narrator tells the story. So the basic part of it, of course, is figuring out, is it a first-person narrator, a second-person narrator, which is pretty rare, or a third-person narrator. Now, sometimes narrators can be more than one, especially if it's a third-person narrator. So first thing to discern while you're reading a short story is as to who is telling the story. Is it a first-person narrator, a third-person narrator, or a second-person narrator? And then that would guide how we extract or extrapolate the point of view of a story, may it be a short story or a novel. So what is a first-person narrator? I mean, simply stated, a first-person narrator is when the story is being told from either a character's point of view or from someone who calls themselves I. That's the first person point of view. So let's say any given story that starts with, I was on my way to the train station. That's a first person narration. Now, what are the advantages of having a first person narrator? Let's say for the author, I mean, the most important thing that an author can gain from using first person narrator is because it can give us the thoughts, perspectives, ways of looking at the world of the main character or the narrator, right? How do they see the world? How do they talk about other characters? How do they talk about the world itself? Most of the times, then, if it's a first person narrator, the story as we read it would revolve around the narrator's point of view, their preferences, their prejudices. Sometimes the first person narrator need not to be the main character. They can be a secondary character who is telling the story, including the story of the main character, right? But from their own point of view. So an important thing to keep in mind when you're dealing with the first person narration is that most critics and most readers find the first person narration not really reliable. Now, it doesn't mean that the first person narrator is always unreliable. It's because most of the times, if someone is telling the story, their own perspective, their preferences, their prejudices are a part of it, right? And so it cannot be a detached view of the world or of other characters. It will be highly motivated by the preferences, prejudices, and thought processes of the narrator themselves. That's why, especially in modern literature, first person narration or first person narrators are not considered highly reliable. And the limitation is that a first person narrator usually cannot give us an omniscient point of view. They can't be privy to everyone's thoughts and actions. They're only privy to their own thoughts and actions. We can only be in their mind, right? And then everything else that we see is from their perspective, from their point of view. Now, this is what an average English class will teach you. If you're a post-colonialist, you add another layer to that, right? You add a layer of, is that first person narrator, do they have an imperial attitude? Do they look at India or Palestine or Iraq from a privileged location of a European traveler or a European colonizer or a settler? So, in that sense, the first person narration will be imbued with the normalized imperial attitudes, right? We can also complicate first person narration further by seeing, is it a patriarchal narrator, right? Is it a narrator who believes that men somehow are superior, right? Their politics then become part of the story. So teasing out not just what a first person narrator is saying, but what their politics could be, how does it come across? And then that will enable us to really decipher and analyze the worldview that they present in the story or the way they talk about other characters. So that's pretty much all that I understand about a first person narrator and their point of view and its significance in any given short story or a novel. The next is second person narration. Now, second person is you. It's pretty rare in literature to have a second person narrator, but they occasionally do appear. When it's a second person narration, the narrator immediately invokes you, the reader. For example, there is a beautiful novel by Italo Calvino, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. The novel starts with, you have just bought Italo Calvino's new novel, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. So as soon as you read the first lines, you become part of the story because the story addresses you. And then as you read the novel as a reader, since you're constantly addressed, you sort of become a character in the novel. Now, this kind of narration also is used in detective fiction, in mysteries, because part of an attempt there is to engage the user or the reader and their curiosity. And I think the second person narration works great when the author intentionally wants the reader's commitment and participation in deciphering the text or in moving the story forward. So that's the second person point of view, second person narration in short stories as well as in novels. Now, of all the points of view and modes of narration and narrators, the third person narrator is the most common, but also the most expensive. A third person narrator can be semi-omniscient, limited omniscient, or all-encompassing and omniscient. So limited omniscient third person narrator would give us, insights into maybe one or two characters' minds. An all omniscient third person narrator would make us privy to the thoughts going on in the minds of every main character in a story. And then semi-omniscient, same thing. Maybe we are in the mind of a main character and any other people that they encounter. Most of the times, third-person narration tends to be more complex and more sophisticated because it allows the author this narrative voice, which is sort of framing the narrative, points to a character, and it can sometimes allow them to give us perspective of one character or another character, right? So, and it allows them to introduce a character through this disembodied third person narration, and then it allows us to see the world through that character's mind. So I just recently taught Jhumpa Lahiri's Interpreter of melodies, right? So in the interpreter of melodies, there is a third person narrator, kind of limited omniscient because we are introduced to the travel guide, Mr. Kapasi, right? And we are privy to his thoughts. But then the third person narration also can describe to us how does he look like, what does he wear, why are his thoughts the way they are, right? Now, had that story been in the first person, all we will have to go by would be what Mr. Kapasi is saying and how he describes himself, right? But now we get his description, his thoughts, and then his perspective on the couple that he's driving with their children, right? So we get a character's perspective through the third person narration. Now, sometimes these things are combined. If you have read Heart of Darkness, I have quite a few videos on it, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, you will see that the novel starts with a third person narrator who introduces the earlier scene, the sailors, the ship coming in, Marlowe starting his story. So we get a first person main frame, third person, sorry, main framing of the story by a third person narrator. And then most of the narrative is in first person because Marlowe is telling the story. So most of the story's action is imbued with the preferences, prejudices, and experiences of Marlowe. But that third person voice allows the author to give us some insights into the larger frames within which the story is told, and also maybe some of Marlowe's thoughts. So these are the three points of view, sort of technical perspectives: the first person narration, second person narration, and third person narration. Now, technically, most of the time, the third person narration is considered less subjective and more trustworthy because it does not include the motivations and preferences and prejudices of the first person narrator. Most complex stories and novels rely on a third person narrator because it gives the author more of a scope to introduce us to different characters and to give us backgrounds to characters. Now, if you look at modern novels, most modernist novels use this kind of perspective through a third person narration, but we are in the minds of the characters, right? If you look at any of Virginia Woolf's novels, Mrs. Dalloway or other, what you see is that we are first in one character's mind, and then we jump into the mind of another character, sometime a character who is watching the character in front of them. And that is done because in stream of consciousness, the author has the freedom to jump from one consciousness to the other, and because the narrative is not controlled by the first person. So these are some of my not too sophisticated thoughts on point of view and on different kinds of narrative strategies and narrators. Now, if you're writing about literature or teaching literature or taking a test like AP English and others, knowing what kind of narrative technique is used, whose point of view is used, and then further exploring whose point of view is privileged. Doesn't matter whether it's a first person narrator, second person, or third person, that would allow you to offer a more sophisticated analysis of any given short story or any given novel. So that's it. That's all I have this time. I hope this is useful to you. Let me know what you think. And if you haven't, please do subscribe to the channel. I would love to have your support. I will now see you next time. Until then, stay safe, take care of each other, and from me to you, peace and love.